Welcome to this AI debate on cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Who decides? Where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from Community Determines and Context Determines. Now, Community Determines.
Between 2015 and 2025, we have seen a clear institutional shift. Museums, universities, and cultural organizations have increasingly returned objects, revised displays, and changed names after consultation with originating communities. This matters because the heart of our disagreement is not whether culture travels, it does, but who gets to decide when that travel becomes harm. I argue that the source community, especially historically marginalized and indigenous peoples, must have primary authority to determine when outside uses of their practices, symbols, dress, language, or sacred objects cross the line from appreciation into appropriation. To frame that claim, we need a working definition grounded in power and history. Cultural appropriation is the taking or use of elements of a culture by outsiders in contexts shaped by unequal power, colonial histories, and systemic privilege, whereas cultural appreciation is respectful, consent-based exchange that acknowledges provenance, context, and reciprocity. That distinction is not academic hair-splitting. It names the difference between extractive reuse and relationship-based sharing. Communities possess cultural sovereignty, the moral and political right to steward their heritage and to grant or withhold consent for its use. Existing legal frameworks and norms already recognize this principle. In the United States, NAGPRA embodies a concrete recognition that descendant communities have authority over certain ancestral objects and human remains, and it establishes procedures for consultation and repatriation. Internationally, instruments that protect intangible cultural heritage emphasize community custodianship and the need for prior informed consent in how traditions are conveyed and represented. Those are not mere formalities. They are mechanisms to correct power imbalances and to enable communities to protect what sustains their identity. Commercial profit from others' cultural expressions without authorization perpetuates economic extraction and compounds cultural harm. International law has long treated illicit transfer and commodification of cultural property as a serious problem, and the norms embodied in conventions addressing trafficking and wrongful acquisition reflect a global consensus that culture should not be monetized without rightful claimants' involvement. When sacred regalia are sold as fashion props, when stereotyped imagery is used to brand products, or when traditional designs are mass-produced with no benefit sharing, the result is cultural erosion and economic dispossession. Protecting sacred items, hairstyles, language, and regalia from misuse is both a moral right and a practical measure to prevent ongoing stigmatization and erasure. The movement to outlaw hair discrimination through laws like the Crown Act shows how cultural forms intimately tied to identity can be sites of legal protection and reparative policy. That example demonstrates that it is possible and just to recognize culturally specific harms and to respond through law and policy. Some will respond that communities are not monolithic and that asking a community to speak with one voice is naive or authoritarian. I acknowledge that internal disagreement exists, but that is not a reason to deny communities custodial authority. Representative processes, consultation with elders and recognized cultural custodians, and community-driven codes of conduct enable legitimate decision-making without pretending unanimity where none exists. The alternative is to let institutions and markets unilaterally decide how living traditions are framed and commodified. Others will call community authority gatekeeping or censorship. That critique mistakes ethical limits for arbitrary barriers. Drawing ethical lines prevents exploitation and preserves the integrity of cultural expression. It does not stop respectful exchange. It steers exchange toward informed consent, attribution, and material reciprocity. Practical mechanisms to operationalize community authority already exist and can be scaled. Community protocols that outline acceptable uses, cultural licensing models tied to benefit sharing, formal consultation processes with elders and custodians modeled on repatriation practices, and institutional codes that require provenance research and community sign-off before display or commercialization. These tools allow for transparent, accountable partnerships rather than ad hoc, extractive interactions. In short, recognizing community primacy over cultural uses protects dignity, addresses ongoing colonial extraction, and makes cultural exchange reciprocal rather than one-sided. Communities that have carried practices across generations are best positioned to judge how those practices may be used by others. And centering their authority is both a moral imperative and a practical route to healing historic wrongs. I urge us to shift from a posture of permissive consumption to one of deliberate, consent-based respect, and to build the legal and institutional frameworks that let communities say yes or no on their own terms.
Now, context determines.
Who gets to decide whether borrowing a song, a hairstyle, or a ceremonial design is theft or tribute? That question lies at the heart of this debate, and my opening claim is simple. The answer should not be a single veto granted to any one claimant, nor should it be a free pass for anyone. It should be a reasoned, contextual judgment that weighs intent, power, impact, manner of presentation, attribution, and who ultimately benefits. This framework treats cultural exchange as a social practice with moral as well as practical dimensions. First, intent matters but cannot be decisive on its own. A person may genuinely admire another culture and adopt an element out of respect, but good intent does not automatically erase harm. Conversely, malicious intent does not always produce measurable injury. That is why assessment must consider both stated purpose and observable effects, because harms, erasure, stereotyping, economic extraction are real and require remedy when they occur. Evidence indicates that clear standards for attribution and collaboration reduce misunderstanding and limit harm, while mere appeals to good intention leave communities exposed. Second, power dynamics and historical inequalities must sit at the center of any adjudication. When cultural forms flow from a history of domination, marginalization, or dispossession, borrowing by those with social and economic power can replicate extraction even if superficially respectful. Asking who benefits economically and who controls the narrative reveals whether exchange is mutual or exploitative. And this is not a theoretical point. International institutions recognize that safeguarding living traditions requires attention to community rights and participation. Third, communities are rarely monolithic. Internal diversity means no single voice universally represents every member, and decisions taken on behalf of a group may reflect particular leaders, commercial interests, or gatekeepers rather than broad consensus. That is why adjudication must look for documented community positions where they exist, and otherwise prioritize inclusive consultation rather than unilateral deference to a single spokesperson. This approach respects democratic internal processes and avoids empowering elite claimants whose decisions may silence dissent. Fourth, commercialization provides concrete, measurable indicators. When cultural expression is commodified, factors such as attribution, licensing, profit sharing, and meaningful compensation become central to whether the transaction is exploitative. Practices that include equitable contracts, revenue sharing, and licensing agreements convert symbolic respect into tangible benefit and reduce the likelihood that creative exchange will become cultural extraction. Fifth, the manner of presentation and the handling of sacred or ceremonial forms matters enormously. Displaying a sacred object as a fashion accessory differs morally from collaborating with tradition bearers to share a ritual in context. Respectful engagement is signaled by consultation, by giving credit, by avoiding sacred symbol misuse, and by ensuring community control over how elements are taught and represented. These are objective indicators that can be operationalized. Sixth, practical adjudication requires transparent tools rather than ad hoc outrage. Industry standards, mediated dispute resolution, restorative processes, and public education campaigns can operationalize contextual criteria and allow disputes to be resolved fairly and constructively. Museums, publishers, and creative industries already have ethical codes and protocols that focus on provenance, consent, and benefit sharing. Scaling and adapting those models produces better outcomes than unstructured public shaming or absolutist prohibitions. Seventh, law and institutional policy have complementary roles. Intellectual property and cultural heritage law cannot solve every problem, but trademarks, sui generis protections for traditional knowledge, museum repatriation policies, and contract law can provide concrete remedies and guardrails when combined with norms that emphasize consultation and consent. Public norms, too, shape behavior. Standards of attribution and expectations of partnership change industry practices when they are widely accepted. I anticipate the objection that any non-deferential posture risks re-traumatizing communities or licensing appropriation. I concede that harm exists and that some claims must be decisive, especially where a community has clearly articulated a position or where sacred practices are at issue. But blanket deference to any single claimant also risks empowering internal gatekeepers, freezing cultural life, and chilling creative exchange that benefits both sides. A context-sensitive process, one that is transparent, impact-focused, and includes avenues for remediation, better protects communities while allowing respectful intercultural learning and creativity. In closing, the question is not whether borrowing can sometimes be theft or sometimes tribute. The question is how we decide. A principled, context-sensitive approach, one that weighs intent, power, impact, representation, attribution, and who benefits, and that uses clear processes for mediation and restitution, best protects vulnerable communities while preserving constructive cultural exchange and creative freedom. That balance is both morally defensible and practically achievable.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from community determines and context determines. Now, community determines.
I agree with much of what was just said. Intent matters, context matters, power matters, and commercialization intensifies harm. Those are not concessions to a vague, moralizing crowd. They are the very reasons the source community must have primary authority. When context is supposed to adjudicate harm, who counts the context? Left unchecked, the institutions and markets that already control narratives will frame context in ways that protect their interests. That is why deferring to the people whose culture is at stake is not favoritism, but corrective justice. Consent from cultural custodians is the most reliable safeguard against repeated extraction. Consider the difference between an outsider wearing a sacred regalia piece as a fashion statement and that same item being shown in a museum with community guidance. One repeats desecration, the other practices stewardship. The same asymmetry appears with hairstyles and identity markers. When a hairstyle tied to a history of policing and exclusion becomes a fashion trend for the privileged, the social harms persist unless the affected community has voice and remedy. Saying communities are not monolithic is true, but it does not erase custodianship. Communities organize themselves through elders, tradition bearers, tribal councils, cultural committees, and written protocols. Those are legitimate decision-making mechanisms. The right response is to formalize representative procedures, not to insist outsiders play judge. Claims of gatekeeping or censorship confuse ethical limits with authoritarian control. No one argues that every cultural exchange must be blocked. We argue that exchanges involving sacred rights, identity markers, or commercial profit require consent, attribution, and fair benefit sharing. That distinction separates respectful appreciation from extractive appropriation. Practically, this looks like community protocols as preconditions for public display or sale, licensing arrangements that mandate royalties or revenue sharing, provenance certification and community sign-off in institutional ethics reviews, reparative funds where prior consent was absent, and fast-track remedies for misuse of sacred items and identity-tied expressions. It looks like community-led mediation panels rather than leaving disputes to PR storms or imbalanced courts. These are not theoretical demands. They are enforceable tools that translate moral claims into tangible protections. Ultimately, the debate is about correcting power, not policing culture. Centering the voices of source communities protects vulnerable people, makes intercultural exchange ethical, and prevents unjust enrichment by outsiders. Where histories of dispossession or sacred meaning are involved, the default should be primacy of consent, coupled with transparent, representative processes for exceptions. That preserves creativity while honoring rights and repairing past harms.
Now, context determines.
I agree with the moral core of their case. Historic power imbalances, economic extraction, and the misuse of sacred items cause real, measurable harm. That is not a point of contention. It is the very reason we need rules. Where we diverge is what those rules should look like. Insisting that a single claimant or a single institutionalized notion of community primacy functions as an automatic veto creates as many problems as it solves. It hands gatekeeping power to whoever claims authority, ignores internal diversity, and risks freezing living cultures into a single snapshot that may not reflect how people actually live and decide. Their strongest pillar is the claim that source communities must have primary authority. I concede communities should have priority in consultation, and that documented community positions deserve heavy weight, but priority is not the same as absolute, unilateral veto. Who counts as a legitimate spokesperson when diaspora members, youth movements, elected councils, and elders disagree? Without transparent criteria for representation, we simply shift discretionary power from museums and markets to opaque internal actors. And not all internal actors are free from commercial influence or political capture. Their second pillar rests on legal and institutional precedents. Laws and repatriation practices rightly create procedures, provenance checks, consultation requirements, and mechanisms for return. Those procedural tools prove my point. Institutions already treat cultural claims as matters to be adjudicated through process, not through instant acquiescence to any single voice. That procedural model translates naturally into a case-by-case framework that centers consultation and remediation while retaining neutral adjudicative safeguards. Their third pillar, harms from commodification and symbolic misuse, is indisputable and exactly why objective indicators matter. We can operationalize harm, absence of attribution, evidence of economic displacement, failure to share revenue, or use of clearly identified sacred objects. Those are adjudicable facts. Turning qualitative grievance into factual criteria both protects communities and prevents capricious shutdowns of creative exchange. Practically, the middle path looks like this. Require documented consultation where feasible. Prioritize transparent benefit-sharing contracts for commercial uses. Establish mediated dispute resolution and restorative remedies, and designate certain sacred items and ceremonies as legally protected from public display or commercialization. Industry codes, education campaigns, and collaborative licensing can prevent harm before it starts. I accept their commitment to dignity and repair, and I share the goal of halting exploitation. But the question is how to do that without stifling the cross-cultural creativity that too often produces mutual enrichment. Which is why I ask them, by what objective rule do you distinguish legitimate custodians from self-appointed gatekeepers? How would you resolve conflicts between diaspora and homeland claimants? What clear test decides when an act is irredeemably exploitative rather than remediable? A contextual, impact-focused framework answers those questions while protecting both communities and cultural exchange.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now community determines.
You were right to insist that intent, context, impact, and commercialization matter. Those factors are central. I accept that weighing them through transparent process is preferable to ad hoc outrage. But those very factors point toward a single practical conclusion. When cultural practices, sacred objects, identity markers, or traditional knowledge are at stake, the people to whom those things belong must have primary authority to decide whether an outside use is respectful or harmful. Why? Because context is not an independent fact you discover in a vacuum. Context is narrated and interpreted, and the parties with power, museums, brands, and wealthy institutions, have long controlled the narrative. Left to third-party neutral adjudicators, context will reliably be read in ways that protect existing power and profit. Consent from cultural custodians is the dependable safeguard against that predictable bias. Consider what happens when a sacred headdress is reduced to aesthetic by a fashion house, or when a hairstyle rooted in resistance is rebranded as trend. Harm is sustained not by bad intentions alone, but by systems that convert other people's meaning into merchandise without permission. Saying communities are internally diverse is true, but it doesn't negate custodianship. Communities organize decision-making through elders, councils, tradition bearers, written protocols, cultural committees, and diasporic bodies. This is how collective self-determination operates in practice. The right response is not to allow random outsiders to be the final interpreters of harm, but to insist on representative procedures that make community consent meaningful and accountable. Claims of gatekeeping miss that this is about ethical limits on exploitation, not censorship of exchange. Respectful cultural exchange looks like prior consultation, clear attribution, benefit sharing, and when sacred meaning is involved, refusal without penalty. Practically, that means community protocols as preconditions for exhibition or sale, cultural licensing that mandates royalties and revenue sharing for commercial uses, provenance certification and community sign-off in institutional ethics reviews, reparative funds where prior consent was absent, and fast-track remedies for misuse of sacred or identity-tied expressions. It also means empowering community-led mediation panels to resolve intra-community disputes with transparent criteria for representation. If we insist instead on neutral, outsider adjudication as the default, we simply transfer discretionary power from public institutions to another form of elite control, and we ask historically marginalized people to prove harms they have long experienced. This debate is not about freezing culture or stopping exchange. It is about correcting power. Where histories of dispossession or sacred meaning are involved, the default should be primacy of consent, backed by transparent, representative processes for exceptions. That is how we protect dignity, enable ethical exchange, and prevent unjust enrichment by outsiders.
Now, context determines.
I accept the moral spine of their case: historic power imbalances, extraction for profit, and the misuse of sacred objects create real harms that demand remedy. That acceptance is the starting point, not the finish line. Their insistence that source communities have primary authority is right in spirit. Communities must have priority in consultation, and their documented positions deserve heavy weight. But priority does not translate cleanly into an absolute unilateral veto, because communities are not monoliths. Diasporic groups, youth movements, elders, elected cultural committees, and everyday practitioners often disagree. Which of these voices, exactly, would be granted irreversible power? If we can't answer that with transparent criteria, we simply replace one opaque gatekeeper with another. Who polices the policed? Who guards the guardians? Those are practical questions, not philosophical quibbles, and they matter because policy must work on the ground. Their examples of institutional repatriation and community protocols actually help my case. Museums and courts already use procedures: provenance checks, consultation, negotiated returns, which shows the world treats cultural claims as adjudicable through process, not by immediate deference to any single voice. That procedural instinct is a strength we should embrace. It lets us weigh intent, power, impact, manner of presentation, attribution, and benefit sharing in a way that is transparent and reviewable. Harm is real when exploitation and disrespect occur, but harm is also reducible to observable indicators: lack of attribution, demonstrable economic displacement, commercialization without compensation, or public misuse of identified sacred items. Those indicators make adjudication possible. A workable middle path therefore centers compulsory, documented consultation where feasible, clear benefit sharing requirements for commercial use, written attribution and provenance labels in public displays, mediated dispute resolution and restorative remedies where harms occur, and legal protection for clearly identified sacred objects and ceremonies. It also invests in preventive education campaigns and industry codes so that respectful exchange becomes the default, not the exception. I concede that consent should carry extra weight when histories of dispossession are present. But giving any one claimant an unchecked veto risks freezing living cultures, emboldening internal gatekeepers, and chilling creative exchange that can be mutually beneficial when done responsibly. So I ask them, what objective test identifies a legitimate custodian versus a self-appointed gatekeeper? How would they resolve conflicts between homeland and diaspora claimants? What clear standard tells us when an act is irredeemably exploitative rather than remediable? Those questions frame my closing. The goal is the dignity and repair they rightly demand, achieved through transparent, impact-focused procedures that protect communities while keeping open the possibility of genuine intercultural collaboration and learning.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, community determines.
When we strip this debate to its core, it comes down to power, consent, and accountability. Cultural exchange is inevitable and often beautiful, but communities that have been colonized, silenced, or commercialized deserve primary authority to say when an outsider's use of their regalia, rituals, language, or sacred objects becomes harm. Think of elders who watch sacred ceremonies reduced to costumes, of students punished for their hair, of artifacts sold in gift shops with no benefit to their makers. These are not abstract grievances. They are violations of sovereignty. Granting source communities that authority is not gatekeeping, it's respecting consent and repairing imbalance. Practical tools, community protocols, cultural licensing, elder consultation, benefit sharing, and reparations make this workable. If we care about justice more than vanity, we defer to those who bear the cost of misuse. Let the voices closest to the harm set the boundaries. That is respect, not censorship, and it is how true appreciation begins.
Now, context determines.
Deciding whether borrowing a song, hairstyle, or ceremonial design is theft or tribute cannot be left to a single shout from any claimant. It must be judged by context, intent, power dynamics, impact, manner of presentation, attribution, and who benefits. Communities are diverse. No single spokesperson perfectly represents them. Objective indicators: respectful engagement, meaningful collaboration, proper attribution, fair compensation when commercialized, and avoiding sacred symbol misuse let us distinguish harm from honest exchange. We've seen respectful music collaborations and chef partnerships produce innovation and shared prosperity. In those cases, context transformed borrowing into partnership. I concede exploitation and cultural injury are real, but blanket deference or blanket permission both fail. A transparent, impact-focused framework supported by industry standards, mediated dispute resolution, restorative practices, and education protects communities while preserving creative exchange. Judge each case by these criteria, and we honor both dignity and dialogue. That balance is the measure of a just, creative society.